Okay.
That's all ready to go now, Susie, sorry.
Okay, no problem. So yes, thank you everyone for your patience, and welcome to this webinar, which is titled Rummaging in Pandora's Box, Child Welfare Social Workers Interventions on Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders. What can we do and what should we do? And we're delighted to have Dr. Liam Curran with us, who's going to present his own research and talk about this issue. So Liam is a qualified social worker and has completed over 20 years in child and family work. His last post in the UK was with the East Riding of Yorkshire Services as a peripatetic principal social worker, and he's specialised in the field of fetal alcohol research for over 15 years. His previously published work was primarily focused on advocacy needs of caregivers, and his doctoral research focuses on the advocacy needs of child welfare social workers and child welfare services. So I'll just run through, actually just before we start, because just to make sure that everyone's clear, that if you've got any questions, please put them into the Q&A rather than into the chat. And just to remember that the session is being recorded, so just remember that when you are typing into the chat. So otherwise we'll get started, and I'll hand over to Liam. So Liam, thank you for doing this webinar, and I'll hand over to you now.
Lovely, thank you, Susan, and good morning to you and to everyone in Wolverhampton. Greetings from Massachusetts here in the US. And so, but yes, Susan, thank you so much. Obviously, we touched on this when we met on Zoom a few months ago or weeks ago. I can't remember now how long ago it was. And we talked a little bit about, and you shared a little bit about the fact that maybe that in your practice, you had engaged with one of these cases. And I do find that over the years of doing this work, that when social workers have experienced it, they have a better understanding of how this is impacting our profession and how it impacts child welfare. So I kind of today, I'm just going to say, as Susan said, I'm going to go through, it's very, very difficult when you kind of talk for a webinar, an hour and a half on a webinar. There's so much to deliver in the fetal alcohol narrative that is trying to hone it down to what is the best thing to say, what is the best presentation to give. As Susan said, I've been in the fetal alcohol education piece now for quite a number of years, and certainly before the PhD, I used to give lots of education events and CPD events for social work there in the UK and in Ireland and in Europe. So I used to give the kind of the full day, and when you're trying to hone it down to an hour, it's quite difficult, because I can remember certainly with full day trainings that social workers would often evaluate that this should be a 2-day training. And it emphasized maybe that for social workers who engage with this and understand this in practice, they understand that it's massively, massively complex for them to engage with. So just before we kind of kick in, I wanted to kind of culture set, if I like to call it, around the whole issue of alcohol and pregnancy. And you can see here from this slide that we've got great variance in the alcohol rates in pregnancy between North America and between the European Union. So in the United States, as of current times, the alcohol rate in pregnancy is 13.6, and in Canada, from quite a while back, they had managed to get the alcohol in pregnancy down to 10.4. In Europe, this study by O'Keefe, it summarized, was a meta-analysis in the European network, but it had the UK at 75%. and it has my own culture across the water at 82%. Now, to clarify, all of these studies refer to any alcohol use in pregnancy. So it's from very mild to heavy use. So it's all the use, because again, from the World Health to their chief medical officers to everyone else, they kind of say that abstinence is the only safe approach in pregnancy. But I think the point I'm making here is contextualizing the fact that when you talk FSD culturally, there are very, very different nuances when you're talking about a culture such as in Europe, where the rates of alcohol in pregnancy are so high, to how you might talk and how you might address this if you're talking in North America. So, and again, what O'Keefe said was the findings of this study have direct implications for policy and practice. Alcohol use during pregnancy is highly prevalent, and evidence from this cohort and cross-country comparison shows that gestational alcohol exposure may occur in over 75% of pregnancies in UK and Ireland. So we talk like about 75%. This extremely high rates in comparison to the European Union. And it kind of, it extrapolates the fact that the impacts on child welfare, again, are going to be much more difficult, although that the focus of child welfare fetal alcohol research has very much been set here in North America over the last, I'm going to talk about 55 years now of research, so over half a century. But the evidence really on the child welfare system is coming from North America. So why are we here? This is my colleague Dorothy Bardry, who is a social work prof over in Canada, and Bardry is a champion of the child welfare piece and of social work education. I know that social workers get educated quite a lot under Bardry in Alberta. So she has been championing the cause for a long time, and she's published quite widely, again, on the social context of fetal alcohol. But she says children and youth require extensive care and support because of the risks and vulnerabilities associated with disability, including mental health support, and critical periods of risk for death and injuries were identified in the early years, in adolescence, and in the transition to adulthood. Another Canadian publication, well, no, not totally Canadian, but Bird and Pavlova in 2019. This publication called Fixing Our Aim, it's really kind of challenged a lot of the traditional narrative around FSD. And it's challenged it because there are some difficulties in the FSD discourse that are beginning to emerge. But again, here you'll see that Bird and Pavlova is talking about 11 million people impacted in our world today, and saying that really we just can't diagnose everyone that's impacted, and saying again that the good news is it is not needed. Most individuals with FSD are insistent of care that with a few modest modifications can greatly improve care for people with FSD and their families. Now, I'm going to say to you, this is a challenging statement coming from that paper. It's a challenging statement in the European network of fetal alcohol, because my own experience would be that the European network is still very heavily held on the diagnostic approach to FSD. And the Bird and Pavlova paper is perhaps, challenging that heavy diagnostic mantra that we are dealing with on FSD. I do want to kind of say to you that Larry Bird and Silvana Pavlova have been in FSD education and research now for probably 15, 20 years. they're not newbies. They have been around. And I kind of say that when they kind of write and talk like this, then we have to sit up and listen, really, that they're saying something here. He also says, secondly, we have to face the fact in FSD. It's not in the face. Most of the complexity of FSD is due to the other problems: prematurity, growth requirements, brain damage, victimization, and inability to avoid exploitation and to live independently are central to the problem. And again, what Burton Pablo was saying here is that, you know, the vast majority of children impacted with FASD do not have the physical features called central feature, the dysmorphic feature, which again is very much what drives a lot of our discourse in the European Union. It's the, oh, he's got FSD, he looks like he's FSD. But again, what the kind of research is saying no is that only around 15 to 20% of children born with, as a result of alcohol exposure, will have a physical dysmorphic feature from that. And it leaves a large cohort of children that are born as a result of alcohol exposure that have no identifying feature, that visibly look the same as any other child. They have normal development, but they will have this brain impairment that will cause all sorts of difficulties in life. And as Burton Pavlova says there, really kind of impacts their ability to navigate life and to live independently as what we all aim for. So in 2022, what I'm saying is that we are way too complex, that the diagnostic criteria is way too complex, resources and service intensive, and they're age restrictive, because again, I'm not aware on the public sphere, certainly, of any adult diagnostic services that are currently operating in the UK. Again, somebody in the room might be able to clarify that for me, but I know it's extremely hard, I think, to get an adult diagnosis in the UK. Typically, for a referral for FSD, assessment diagnosis requires prior determination of prenatal alcohol exposure. Again, this is a massively complex factor of the FSD assessment and diagnosis piece in the European Union, is that we don't routinely collect alcohol and pregnancy information on prenatal or postnatal files. So having confirmation of prenatal alcohol exposure, which is fundamental to the vast majority of children or young people that might be looking at a diagnosis piece. I say the vast majority because you do not need to have alcohol confirmation for fetal alcohol syndrome. So again, that's the one category where it's in the face. And because it's dysmorphic and because they have visual features, you can diagnose without the confirmation of prenatal alcohol exposure. But what I'm saying is that's the only diagnosis that can happen without confirmation. All the other pieces of fetal alcohol or FSD have to be diagnosed with the confirmation of prenatal alcohol exposure. The specific criteria for assessment of exposure that serve each clinic, but this information may be difficult to access in many cases. And again, there's a lot of confusion and contradiction in this field of fetal alcohol and in the confirmation or around diagnoses. There's a lot of competing factors. Burton Pavlova again talks about that 11 million, and it's not tenable to diagnose everybody. And I kind of think, you know, I make myself kind of popular by talking about this fact that, you know, we're just coming up on 55 years of fetal alcohol research. And I talked here about it's a tsunami. There is so much in the field of fetal alcohol research that it can be hard at times to figure out what's right and what's good and what's not, because of the rate of publication that happens in the fetal alcohol and FASD field. And I suppose, like, you know, what I'm saying is that certainly what's happening currently now is moving and kind of flipping the script away from diagnosis as a primary narrative. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm not moving and flipping the script and saying we don't diagnose. What I'm trying to develop in education is that we've got to move it away from being that dominant private narrative. We've got to look at other approaches to children and young people around FASD. And we got to be able to have a healthy debate around the fact that perhaps diagnosis is not and shouldn't be the dominant discourse in every case, and that we need to find other ways to meet the needs and to move towards meeting the needs of children. I kind of say that we need to kind of move something. We need to change the narrative slightly because the cost burden is massively climbing. Now, again, all of these studies are based in North America here, but I know growing up in Ireland, like you used to say that what happens in America eventually comes to Ireland. So I'm saying what happens in the cost burden. Yes, eventually you'll get publications that will talk about cost burdens in the UK and Ireland, but I'm saying you can equally extrapolate that fetal alcohol is costing significant amount to the public health finances. The first line there is about child welfare. This is again, Pavlova. She's an kind of extensive researcher in the field of social work and child welfare from the University of Pavlova, the University of Toronto. And again, she talks about the cost ranging from 59 to 198 million dollars in the Canadian system. But going back to 2009, Stade brought in a figure of 5.3 billion. Chakraborty brought in a figure of 7.3 billion. Then Tan and Johnson, it moved again to 9.7 billion. And then Johnson in 2019 brought it up to 10 billion a year. These are all really based in the Canadian system. Again, what I'm saying to you, just remember there what I said on cultural context, that Canada has a national drinking rate in pregnancy of 10.4%. That varies from, because it's an average, Prince Edward Island is, I think, 5.4, over to the state of Quebec, where I was based from a PhD, it's 27%. So Quebec, Canada has variations within the different provinces. But I still say to you that their national average is I think one of the best in the world. They have worked very, very hard to bring that down, but their cost burden is still climbing. And the cost burden, you know, many people will ask me, but where can 10 billion come from? Well, certainly, you know, when you look at the costs directly of child welfare, when you look at the costs of diagnostics, when you look at the costs right across the board, because these children and young adults will have multiple health needs, and those are costly on the system again. So costs do climb, they are there. We don't have these cost burden narratives in either UK or Ireland, but we do have FASD, and we do have the same structures of the fact that these children will be accessing the same sort of services and structures that the children in Canada are accessing, and therefore, again, that our cost burdens are not published yet. They're coming, but I'm saying this is why we've got to try and change the narrative slightly and try and get involved better so that we can address this public health cost burden. I think you and I in the room can accept that our public health system is under a great deal of strain at the minute in both our cultures, and costs are something that both health systems are looking at in terms of trying to save money because of the pressure that's on the system. And certainly that the costs that are associated with fetal alcohol is an area that we need to look at and see, can we reduce those cost burdens? So the science is telling us that alcohol-related birth defects and developmental disabilities are completely preventable when pregnant women abstain from alcohol use. That's the World Health Organization, chief medical officers, and any array of publications that have happened in the last 50 years. I talk about 50, well, coming up 55. It was Paul Lemon in France in 1968 that brought forward really our first European publication on fetal alcohol. It's interesting because there was two factors that result in that paper, not really of 1968 with Paul Lemon, was that it was in French and it didn't travel in the Western world in the same way as latter publications did. And also that Paul Lemon, although he identified fetal alcohol, at the time, he didn't really give any kind of direction of how to deal with it. And it was 1973 in the Lancet Journal of Jones and Smith that really kind of brought that whole discussion onto the Western culture, because Jones and Smith did publish in the Lancet Journal, and it did kind of go around the world very quickly. I think one thing that Jones and Smith paper of the Lancet Journal of 73 that is not talked about and is not rated in the discourse is that it was 8 children that were taken from the Washington child welfare system, not taken, but that had been presented from the Washington child welfare system. And the children were suffering had labels of failure to thrive. And these traditional labels that we use in child welfare around neglect. And I say they were subsequently diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. And I say it's an area that doesn't get talked about, but that's where really is a critical point for us starting to understand how FASD impacts with our child welfare system, is that it's very clearly there in that very pivotal publication of 73. And it's very pivotally there in terms of failure to thrive and children of our child welfare system being subsequently diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. So again, FASD is a lifelong disability. And so neurocognitive, neurobehavioral, etc., will be there in the lifelong. I think adults with FASD manage to accommodate much better. So it's not as obvious in our adult population. And a simple reason I say that is I think that once the individual passes 18 and goes into our adult sphere, I think as society, we don't put measurements on 18 plus. We are putting measurements on 0 to 18 because we are expecting development and we're expecting the trajectory of these children to meet these milestones and to produce the way that they should in terms of a developmental child. So what I'm kind of saying there in a difficult way, we do have societal expectations and measurements, if you like, of what we expect in child development, but we don't have those in adults. And this is why I'm saying that although the disability is lifelong, it's less visible in the adult sphere, except for the individuals who will come forward acknowledging their difficulty with the condition. I think the most difficult side of FSD as the adult, unfortunately, because of our lack of engagement in the child and youth service side of it, is that many young adults with FSD are ending up in the criminal justice system. They're ending up in mental health services. And so again, we don't see FSD in that context. We see traditional labels, so that they are, you know, they're a bad child, they're a criminal because they got involved in crime. They have mental health condition, but we'll never talk about the etiology being prenatal alcohol exposure. They have mental health problems. So again, we dilute the whole fetal alcohol issue in the post-18 stage. So we have to come back to in children, the early recognition assessment term for any of the conditions along the continuum of FSD can result in improved outcomes. That's clearly acknowledged in the body research, that early intervention and assessment is critical to try and ensure that the trajectory is not negative and that we're not heading into criminal justice, mental health, etc. I would say, like, you know, that unfortunately, this is where we're failing at the moment. Now, interestingly, I'm not sure if anyone's in the room actually from my, I did a Zoom consult yesterday with 3 social workers and a youth worker in the US. And again, they had contacted me because a 15-year-old that was really not in the best places at the moment. The 15-year-old has 7 diagnoses to date, and he's on 5 different antipsychotic medications. The reason that they're looking for intervention and help is that he has had a number of suicide attempts, and they are desperate to try and find solutions. And I guess, like, you know, again, in talking in the consult yesterday, I kind of said to the social workers, you know, we have all these diagnoses, we have all these medications, but here we are today still looking for a solution. And again, in this young man's case, really the issue of fetal alcohol is only starting to present now at 15, because everything else has failed. Every other diagnosis is failing. The medication is not working. They're still struggling. And so, again, what I'm saying to you, that although I said that US is massively ahead on statistics such as alcohol and pregnancy, my experience in talking to social workers here in North America is that they're in the same boat as most social workers that would be in Ireland or in England, because social work historically in this narrative is not in the discourse sufficiently. We kind of, yeah, we don't get profiled very well within the FSD discourse. And I think that's something that I'm trying to advocate for change, is that certainly the child welfare social worker has a pivotal role in the whole FSD discourse, which I'm going to come on to shortly. Societal acceptance of disability is imperative to achieving improved outcomes. Clarity and consistency is imperative in public health messaging. And I guess what I mean by that is that obviously you can get a lot of misinformation in society today, in that I think that most health topics now, that most of the professions in any health topic is warning about caution on social media. And so social media does not give clarity or consistency on the issue of alcohol and pregnancy. It's very interesting. University of Canberra in Australia did a study a couple of years ago on social media and alcohol and pregnancy. And in that study, they found that 72% of social media postings were wrong, inaccurate, or blatantly misleading in terms of alcohol and pregnancy. So 72 of 115, I think it was, of that they assessed. So that's a high level of misinformation. And that kind of ties in with the whole lack of clarity, consistency. Because certainly, yes, I do get, when I was doing the face-to-face education or the CPD education in the UK or in Ireland, I would get a lot of people believing that things like, well, the third trimester is safe, low level is safe, wine is not as difficult, not as dangerous as hard liquor, all these sort of things. What again I'm coming back to say is that Chief Medical Officer, World Health, whatever, abstinence is the only safe message that we can do. I'm just realizing not delivering a massage. That's a bit of a typo. All narratives and discourses need to be mindful of not delivering a message which is stigmatizing either to birth moms or those living with disability. There's a high level of stigma that operates in society. Birth moms feel very, very stigmatized because of an uneducated narrative that operates in society. I say that because, like, you know, that I co-delivered there in Nottingham in the UK prior to the PhD. I co-delivered with a birth mum a day's training for foster carers. And I was very, very aware of the fact that her story is very, very common in many birth mums that talk about why they drank in pregnancy, that again, the lack of knowledge for them to understand that perhaps the risk is there. And you might say, but sure, everyone knows that now, but we don't know that. And I think that's the problem. I mean, I think World Health, Chief Medical Officers, even Wolverhampton City Council, you have a good information piece on your website, and you have a very clear message around alcohol and pregnancy in Wolverhampton City Council. And you have a nice little feature, which I hadn't seen before, but you can actually print that as a leaflet. So that's a kind of an interesting little development that I've seen. But I guess what I'm coming back and I'm trying to say here is that we are very good at circulating these informations on social media, but that can't be our single and our only response to trying to prevent FSD, because as I just mentioned with that University of Canberra study, I think Holland is the name of the researcher, that social media is not safe for alcohol and pregnancy or even FSD narratives. And we have to be careful about how the language is taken, and we have to be careful about how that impacts birth mums. I kind of, you know, I'm very clear that birth mums, there's a number of factors why women drink, and it can be mental health, it can be substance misuse disorders. The woman I co-delivered with in the UK was a survivor of intimate partner violence, of domestic violence. And she would have told her story that in the domestic violence, she had been emotionally isolated from her peer supports, her family, whatever. And due to the domestic violence, she would often console herself with alcohol. And both her kids have FASD and are now in the young adult stage. Again, we come back that there's no amount of alcohol intake should be considered safe. There is no safe level in pregnancy. There's no safe trimester in pregnancy. And again, I'm saying to you that if you can take that out in the community, because it is probably the most common misinformation years of work in this, is that the third trimester is safe. And the belief is that, oh, the fetus is physically formed by the third trimester, and therefore the risk has reduced because the fetus is physically formed. The problem is that the third trimester is actually the critical period for the brain wiring piece, the synapses connections forming in the central nervous system. That happens in the third trimester. So it is a critical period, and it is potentially the area where the majority of fetal alcohol and FASD cases are coming from. When I'm saying the majority, because their fetal alcohol disability, because they've not got FAS and they've not got the complete facial feature of dysmorphics, but they have got this brain impairment piece. And I say it may be because we have this large cohort, maybe 80% of those that are born with this hidden disability are living with this brain impairment. And it is potentially in this third trimester where the potential risk for that impairment is happening. Because again, it is the time of central nervous system, the brain construction, and the tiny wiring, the synapses connections, all are happening at that stage. It is a massive misinformation in community. And I again ask you that you take that out, and try and educate on it. Again, potentially with a good leaflet, whether it be from Wolverhampton City Council or from the Chief Medical Officer in the UK, that you have some sort of a leaflet supporting the argument that you're making that there's no known safe level in alcohol. And again, saying that binge drinking, it relates to the dose, so the binge drinking relates to the severity, if you like, of fetal alcohol, and that's the FAS, you know. And the third trimester is the highest risk in terms of brain wiring. And again, you probably have seen this graph over many years, but it never fails to be useful in describing. And you see there across on the first green line that the central nervous system, that the brain is at risk all through all stages of development. And you'll see as you come down on the slide that the different pieces are at risk at different stages in development. And you can see why that some people will think the third trimester is safe because the physical is achieved, because kind of the physical development has achieved by the end of the second semester. But again, like, you know, this brain piece is going on, and you get the eyes, ears, you get the hearing. And again, these are the areas that often that in the FSD discourse, that visions, that auditory learning, hearing, all of these factors play in quite a lot because they're in the third trimester, and is potentially where the harm is happening. So again, what I'm saying is we've known this now, well, 68 from Paul Lemon, but again, Jones and Smith in 73 and 74 was really the kind of the launching piece in Europe and North America. Damage to the central nervous system of prenatal alcohol has affected across the lifespan. Stress gut. And stress gut is a powerhouse of the research field in fetal alcohol. And she's written extensively on what I call the psychosocial side. Her 96 and indeed her 97, but a 96 study was a longitudinal study of 54 adults. No, much more. But it was 0 to 54 was the age group of individuals with fetal alcohol. But she clearly demonstrated in that study of the secondary disabilities, of the mental health, the addiction, the school failure, the inappropriate sexual behaviors. All of that is documented clearly in Anne's stress gut. I would wish that social workers would read that study, because I think, you know, it is so pivotal in showing us the trajectory of children, that where the intervention is not given, then the trajectory is quite poor, and where these children are sliding into. And like the consult I did yesterday, that 15-year-old man, I don't know, I pray, I hope that we can get that kid back. But at the same time, I'm nervous that so much intervention has happened, so many diagnoses have happened, so many medications have happened, and we're not anywhere near finding a solution. So again, Stress Gut's work of showing the trajectory is a powerful piece of work. It's a good point maybe to say that I'm a little kind of concerned that we have a bit of a cancel culture in fetal alcohol, and the cancel culture, it kind of involves cancelling out researchers and cancelling out their work, because I was told not so long ago that Anne Stress Gut's work is dated, that it's not relevant anymore. I think, you know, where we are, if we go into that cancel culture of cancelling the research that has been done, then we're just going to go around in a circle, and it's just becomes cyclical, that we just keep researching and training and researching and training, but it's a cyclical motion because we dismiss. Now, I don't subscribe to the cancel culture. I absolutely don't. And I kind of think there's pivotal studies in the FASD discourse and in the fetal alcohol discourse that have so shaped our thinking and where we're at today, and that they are as relevant and as valued today as they were when they were published. And I think the work of Stress Gut is pivotal in that. And so again, I've talked about it for a while now, and now I'm coming in saying, what is FASD? Well, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders is an overarching term that encompasses a range of possible diagnoses associated with alcohol exposed pregnancy, and that was Bertram 2004, and included fetal alcohol syndrome, partial fetal alcohol, alcohol-related birth defects, and then neurobehavioral disorder as a result of prenatal alcohol exposure, NDPAE. Now, there may be someone in the room that straight away is saying, oh, that's changed, because in 2016, a paper got published in Canada. Cook and colleagues published a paper that made FASD, this umbrella term, as a diagnostic term, and suddenly said that FASD is a diagnosable condition. I remember being in my PhD in Montreal, I'm thinking, oh, wow, that is earth-shattering concept. Because if nothing else, it had completely wiped out everything that I'd published to date. It had cancelled everything that I'd done. Because suddenly, because I used to train, and if there was anyone in this group today that had been on CPD training with me prior to the PhD, you would have heard me talking about the fact that FASD is not a diagnosable condition, that it's an umbrella term, etc., etc. So in 2016, this happened. Then I saw that Scotland picked it up and that Scotland ran with this. FASD is a diagnosable condition. And now in the UK, in NICE guidelines are clearly running with this concept that FASD is a diagnosable condition. I'm going to talk about it as we go in, because it's problematic. But across the spectrum, fetal alcohol are present across countries and cultures, and prevalence and rules threaten with prevalence rate threatening to rise in the coming years. In order to support children and families around the world, researchers must work to disseminate and implement evidence-based interventions. However, each cultural context presents unique elements and barriers to implementation process. I kind of go on and on about this fact of cultural context. So again, just on what I talked about, if we import FASD as a diagnosable condition from Canada, we're importing an FASD development from a culture that has been working on FASD for many, many years, where they have, in some parts of Canada, they have a lot of services. In Alberta, I think they have 24 multidisciplinary assessment and diagnostic centers for a population of 4.4 million. They have 24 multidisciplinary team settings for that. I know many of you in the room would think, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we had one, or at least that we could access one. And that goes for both Ireland and England. I know Raj Mukherjee is there in London, does the diagnoses. But again, I'm coming back to the whole concept of multidisciplinary assessment piece, that we're not very good on that. So again, what I'm talking about today, you know, what I'm saying to you is that FASD is across the lifespan. It's infants, toddlers, preschool, school-age children, adolescent, teens, and adults. So that's what FASD, and that's what the challenge is for us. Now, again, I'm not doing skill-based education today. This is what I do in the CPD pieces. I break down this into what are the signs and symptoms in infancy, what is the signs and symptoms in school-age children that we would be looking for. I don't have the time to do that sort of skill-based work in a webinar today. But it's out there, there's evidence out there. It might be a good time to plug some work. Yeah. Any social workers in the room, I would heavily recommend trying differently rather than trying harder by Diane Malbon, who's a social worker in the US. Again, I'm coming back to the fact that this book is 2004. It is as relevant today as it was back then. But it's the title that is very, very kind of important, is that we have to think differently with these children and with these kids. My consult yesterday, the social workers and the youth worker, trying to get them to think differently, because I suppose they were very heavily focused on the medical model, the diagnostic model, and they were very heavily focused on the medication pieces. and they were looking for solutions in that way. I'm saying think differently, think differently. So you have that. I unashamedly plug my own co-authored book that I wrote with a foster carer there in the UK, Understanding Fetal Alcohol, a guide for carers, parents and professionals. Again, in that book, we talk a lot around the different stages of development and child development and the different things that would happen at the different stages. So what I'm saying to you, yes, I do this in training, I do this in CPD training, but I also say there's good resources out there that you can learn this if you're kind of willing to read it, basically. The Understanding is Jessica Kingsley, and it's available on Amazon. It's available on LinkedIn or on Kindle, etc., etc. I was very chuffed, like, you know, because I gave a number of trainings at McGill University in Canada, but as a result of that, McGill University commissioned Understanding Fetal Alcohol into their social work library. And so, yeah, it was just nice to see a University of McGill standing actually validate the publication and to put it in the social work piece of the library so that it would be there for social workers. So I'm not sure if it's in your library, if you're a student, whatever. If it's not in your library, you could ask them to put it in your library, because I know it's in McGill's library. That's all. And so anyway, we move on. So the 4 key areas of FSD that I'm going to talk about as we go through is diagnostic, distinct areas is prevention, identification, recognition and assessment, and lifespan needs, and professional education and development in our allied health structures. Again, this is fairly standard stuff that's out there. This is kind of fairly standard areas that people would talk about that we need to. Personally, I would like to put professional education and development first, prevention second, and blah, 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 and lifespan at the bottom. The reason I say that is that when I did CPD education, I can remember clearly the evaluations and social workers primarily talking to me and saying, you know, that they had not been aware of this, that they're going to go back to their colleagues in the office, that they're going to share what they'd learned, etc., etc., etc. I had a lot of positive comments in my work over the years of women thanking me for giving them and empowering them with the clear, concise message on alcohol and pregnancy. And so again, a fear that maybe is in child welfare system or in education systems about addressing FSD is, oh God, no, we can't go there. We're going to upset. We're going to stigmatize. I'm saying to you, my personal experience of delivering CPD days of training is that delegates who are mainly women, when you do social work and child welfare, your statistical piece is that. I think my last CPD day in Dublin in Ireland was 24 women and 2 men, which I think is a standard statistic for child welfare. The thing that shocked me yesterday, I was doing 3 social workers and a youth worker, and they were all male. And that statistic that blew my head. But anyway, that goes differently. So professional education is the gap. It is a major, major gap. And again, by the end of this, you'll see when I talk about professional education, you will see what I mean by that. And we'll talk some more. I wanted to kind of just throw in the middle of this that New Zealand have a really good action plan. Now, there's anyone that could be, you know, in the room from New Zealand, they'll think, oh, no, we don't do that. But their action plan of 2019 was, 2016, 2019 was really quite positive. It was quite positive because all of these ministries had sat down at the table, and it was very much led by the child and family, the child and youth and family services. So child and family were very engaged with the whole fetal alcohol prevention strategy in New Zealand. New Zealand and Ireland often wrestle for the podium position on alcohol rates in pregnancy. So it has very, very high rates, similar to UK and Ireland. But I do admire the fact that as state agencies, they were able to sit down together, understanding that fetal alcohol impacts all service structures. It goes across the education, the justice, the health, right across the board. So it was just great to see that there. Again, we have prevalence rates going back quite significant years. We have research telling us that we have a problem in child welfare. You can see the dates on here. What's the oldest one is 2011, is Selwyn in the UK, who had a 30% finding. The second last one there, Gregory in Peterborough in the UK. Gregory had a 27, so 27, 30%. In or around that ballpark, you can split it into 28.5%. But that's roughly what you're looking at in terms of a prevalence rate. Canada, 16.9 is the prevalence rate by Lang and colleagues. Again, what I'm going to do is contextualize again the cultural piece. Go back to what I said about the rates of alcohol rates in pregnancy is 10.4 in Canada, and their child welfare population of suspected FSD or FSDs is 16.9. Our rates of alcohol in pregnancy in UK and Ireland, we kind of extrapolated that between 75 and 82% for Ireland, 75% for the UK. So 30%, 27%. Certainly, one of my delegates, who's a social worker, is one of my participants in my PhD, who I given CPD education to prior to my PhD. That in the data, she offered that she felt that Ireland's child welfare system was potentially around the 35%, and that's, yeah, I think that's a fairly good assessment. That 35% rate. Canada, Pavova again, you'll hear that name a lot. 32 times higher. The prevalence rate is 32 times higher than non-impacted children in the child welfare system. What I'm saying is that, and again, I mentioned there that the Jones and Smith paper in the Lancet Journal, that those children came from the Washington child welfare system with failure to thrive before they were diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. I guess what I'm getting at here is that the child welfare system has been engaged with, it has been talked about, it has had a foot in the FSD discourse, but it's not developed that. And although these prevalence studies keep getting published, it's not making much of an impact, because I'm talking to social workers on a regular basis. I was talking yesterday to social workers here in the US who are bereft of education, of policy, of procedure, of protocols to manage FSD. And I think that is fundamentally a fault in our system that we need to correct. If there's any foster carers in the room, I know I did a lot of work training foster carers and doing consult before my PhD. I know that you are often very frustrated with your social worker because you feel your social worker is not doing what you want them to do. I often now make pleas in my training and education to say, please, to the foster carers, please be kind to your social worker, because they do not get training. They do not have policy. They do not have procedure. And it's rare in Ireland, England, to get it mentioned in undergraduate social work education. So again, that's why I'm so chuffed that Susan invited me to give this talk at Wolverhampton. Because at least if it's talked about, and if it's talked about in social work undergraduate, because again, I've had a number of social workers that tell me, it came through in the data of my PhD, that they said that this was never discussed, it was never mentioned in our social work education. Again, you can see on the left-hand side there, Bardry and Choate, 2015. Their paper was that disability, fetal alcohol is a disability in need of training in social work in 2015. The paper was really focusing on a child death in the Canadian system of a child that had died. Again, of the child that had died, had been in foster care. Now, the interesting of that case was that the child wasn't, the died wasn't the FASD, it was the child who, in an impulsive act, killed him in foster care in Canada. Interesting, the child was 10 years old, who had been diagnosed with a fetal alcohol impairment, had been returned to the child welfare system, but nobody knew about the diagnosis. Nobody knew that he had special education needs, etc. He had an assigned mental health worker who did not know that the child had a diagnosis of fetal alcohol. Again, that paper, again, talking about the thorny subject and the difficult subject, the fact of a child fatality. But again, I think it emphasizes, I read a report of the child advocate regarding that case, and it was clear that this child was just diagnosed and dropped back into the child welfare system, and the diagnosis meant nothing. And again, I think we have to be wary of that happening. I'm very, very clear in my education now that a diagnosis is in an adoptive family. If you can get the diagnosis, if you can get the money and the supports to have a diagnosis in an adoptive family, I agree with that. I agree with the fact that the child is going back after the diagnosis into a safe, secure, loving environment. And that is what a child needs in the post-diagnostic piece. But children of the child welfare system being diagnosed and going back into insecure training and insecure home life, etc., whether it be in foster parent, whether it be in residential care, alternative care, diagnoses will not work if the child is not in, as I just described, a secure, safe, violence-free type environment. And that's why I'm saying, yes, a diagnosis can work for an adoptive parent, but outside of that, the diagnosis gets very problematic. Okay, I'm going to flick now into your kind of stats before I move into the other piece. As of the 31st of May, you have 80,850 children in care, in looked after children. That you have 67 under 18 per 10,000 children. That's Bath. We're talking that. Your ethnicity of your children looking after. And again, all these factors play into FSD because you know, when you talk about culture, then you talk about the micro aspects of culture, and you talk about the different cultures' identity within culture, and you talk about, you know, when I talk about culture, certainly as a former social worker in Yorkshire, culture is very different in the north of England to the south of England. That will have a very different effect in terms of how alcohol is used, how alcohol is visualized within that community. So these are the cultural pieces. And then within that culture, you have cultural identities that maybe are not involved with alcohol, that do not use alcohol in the same way as the majority culture does. All the parts are parts of the narrative that need to be discussed. So the legal status of children, the 63,000 were on care orders and 12,340 looked after under voluntary arrangement under Section 20. Okay. Yeah, I wanted this statistic down on the bottom here. The 70% of looked after children had one placement in year, 21% had two placements, and 9% had 3 or more placements. The level of potentially hidden FSD or suspected FSD in the 21% and the 9% of children that are breaking down placements or having placement disruptions, the potential there, I mean, the evidence has been written, the stats have been written, the studies have been written. These children, because of neurocognitive, neurobehavioral problem, the level of placement breakdown and disruption is quite high, because they cannot, they don't work. And so caregivers often give up. As foster carers, they feel that, you know, the 24/7 care needs that some of these children have just becomes too much. So I kind of say that they are in placement breakdowns, and a child that continually has placement breakdown, that is something for a social worker to consider, the fact that it may be unseen FSD that you're dealing with. Oh. Yeah, I mentioned that earlier. That's the standard statistic. I think around gender in child welfare social work, and I kind of make that point there at the bottom that gender has to be a key consideration in fetal alcohol discourse. When we're talking about education in social work and social welfare and in child protection and whatever, the vast majority of child welfare social workers are going to be female. They're going to be female of childbearing age. And therefore, I would contend that female social workers of childbearing age need to wrestle with this on a personal value base as much as the professional value base. And that, yeah, there has to be acknowledgement of that within the training so that female social workers can feel comfortable in moving to that professional value base of dealing with cases of fetal alcohol and FSD and working with birth mums in the professional context. So I say that because, again, from my CPD work prior, the vast majority of my delegates were female, and I kind of could see and experience the fact of the discourse going through that personal stroke professional conflict around alcohol use in pregnancy and what their view was, etc. I will say to you that some of you think, oh God, this is so blah blah blah. I delivered full CPDs and I never had a negative experience of someone rejecting the message. I never had anyone leave the training. Kind of people going out at lunch and not coming back. Didn't happen. People wanted this education. And I say female social workers, the majority in child welfare, you know you're dealing with this on your caseloads. You know that this is problematic in your work. And I think I clearly saw that you wanted this education as much as anyone else. Okay. So I don't want to go, I want to kick through. I'm really conscious I didn't bring okay. So the legal status is section 20, section 31. What I wanted to say here, when you're looking at this, in the US here, in 2010, the CAPTA legislation, the Child Abuse and Protection, the CAPTA, which is the statutory legislation here in the US, it was amended in 2010, and FSD was placed in the child protection legislation as a mandated requirement of social workers to plan safe care. What I say to you in Ireland, England, in regarding fetal alcohol, we have that responsibility anyway. Under the Child Care Act 1989 and 1991, we have a duty to make the most appropriate plan for a child depending on the circumstances of the case. We have a mandated duty, and that mandated duty, although it's specified specifically on FSD in the US, it's the same mandated duty on any child that we're working with in terms of FSD and fetal alcohol in our services. It is a massively difficult topic, I know, and this is why doing an hour is difficult. How can I kind of get there? How can I cover all the bases? It's not possible in an hour. Fetal alcohol is still very stigmatized in cultures, etc. Due to poor education content, concerned caregivers fear their child will be further stigmatized when seeking interventions to help address the child's needs. A majority of statutory services do not acknowledge FSD as a qualifying criteria for services. This reinforces the stigma. Currently, NIDS, the National Disability Insurance Service in Australia, I got told, oh no, in Australia, FSD, you can get qualified for disability. And I was like, come on. So I looked it up and I found out in Australia, you can get fetal alcohol syndrome as qualified under disability legislation, and therefore gets the supports, the cares, the financial supports, etc., as a fetal alcohol under the National Disability Insurance in Australia. And as of 2021, because somebody did lecture me that I didn't know the fact that children with FSD and caregivers with FSD could get disability payments. And I was like, okay, that's new. That's my information there of 2021 from the National Disability Insurance Service in Australia, that only FAS is possible in there. And the role of child welfare social workers, very, very complex. Kind of the third bullet point there, the thing that keeps coming across to me in talking with social work is lacking a pathway to deal with these cases when they present. And I have a little bit of pilot data. This is my pilot. I do have a variety of children for whom I do have concerns for in this regard. And I've asked the doctor at the clinic what her perceptions this was. And she said, well, you just have to wait and see. Not very helpful. And that was Philippe in Montreal. This is quite a common kind of narrative that's coming through in data from social workers, that social workers often get dismissed, if you like, are often placed in kind of a very subservient role regarding fetal alcohol. And I'm saying to the social workers in the room, I'm saying to the social work academics, this is a statutory obligation of social work. And social work needs to be able to be empowered to do that statutory mandated work. And therefore, I say to my allied health colleagues, this sort of dismissing of social work in the FSD discourse is not helpful, because the social worker is trying to plan safe care. The social worker is trying to uphold the statutory obligations and is trying to work a multidisciplinary piece. So dismissing or placing in a subservient role, that's not helpful to the whole process. And again, I'm just going to briefly touch on, I'm not going to talk because I know it's traumatic for certainly caregivers, But the reason why we have to step up in child welfare is that public health coroners are now talking about failures in the child welfare system quite significantly. And these are all children who have died in the child welfare system, where FASD was a factor in their death. And I have Max there at the bottom, 26, because Max was adopted from the care system, fostered adopted from the care system. And his adoptive mother tried to move heaven and earth for him. But unfortunately, he didn't make, he died in a police cell when he was 26. But he has a significant care history, and that was why he was there. Brooklyn was in residential care in Canada. She got upset with the residential social workers and she barricaded her room, set her mattress on fire, and died of smoke inhalation. Again, the cause and effect concept in FASD, she would have not understood the cause and effect of setting fire to her mattress may potentially cause her the problem she obviously had, which was she suffocated. So they're not able to kind of process that piece through, that if I burn this, I'm going to have that. So she died in case. So again, how can I say this in a nice way? These scenarios, these cases are happening more frequently. Public health coroners are starting to write and clearly identify the child welfare system as failing these kids. My worry is that social work is vulnerable. No social worker wants to have a child who suffers a fatality on their caseload. And again, this is where I say to social workers that it's important that you speak up, that if you are being treated in a subservient manner or you are not being engaged with on your statutory obligation, you need to speak up and demand that you have education, demand that you have policy procedure to help you in this, because these cases are getting more frequent. I could spend the whole 2 hours talking about coroner reports of children in the fetal alcohol and in the child welfare system, but I don't think my audience would like that. So I'm going to go on. Service gap is that emerging documentation concerning failure of child welfare system to plan safe care for children is evident. A statutory instrument in Western child protection and welfare duties, that's your duty. Child welfare are mandated to plan safe care for children, and evidence suggests that child welfare are under-resourced in knowledge, procedure, and protocols to offer guidance when interfering. And you kind of have that little visual there of the child welfare social worker holding the plank of wood, trying to build their own pathway. I say to social work academics, they need to have that pathway at least semi-constructed when they leave social work education. And so, yeah, we'll leave it at that. There's two major narratives that are slightly overpowering, that is dominating the discourse. And I call it the medical model because of the diagnostics, and the advocacy, organized advocacy model, which is often, you know, that advocacy can be quite challenging on the process. I plead with caregivers, please be kind to your social work. They're doing the best they can. Again, going back to Alberta, 24 multidisciplinary service centers for assessment and diagnosis, 4.4 million people. That was created because social workers and foster carers came together, wrote out their competitive needs, if you like, because they both have needs in this discourse, and they wrote that to their local elected official. And that was in 1992 that happened in Alberta, that was a strategy for social workers and foster parents to work together. And that's why you have that service today. Irene Shankter, she's a sociologist. Really good paper to read about that history, about how that happened. Okay. Very quickly, my research was to how do child workers respond to children living with, and the goals in the grant to understand the current practice of child welfare research, to understand child welfare and fetal alcohol. I had 11 social workers, I had 3 foster parents, 1 midwife, 1 psychologist, staff development, occupational therapist. So I had 14 female and 4 male. Again, statistically, that kind of fits with child welfare. Ethics approval for my work from TUSLA, the state system of Irish child welfare system, and also from the Irish Foster Care Association, where I did, because I talked to foster care. So there was quite a lot of ethics collection. I used this Kathy Sharma's as a constructive grounded theory. So it's constructive grounded theory. And my interviews range from 45 to 65 minutes. This is a quick diagram of my analysis. I'm moving on because I'm realizing I'm drifting. I'm going to keep going too. So my finding and my research was that social workers are advocating against the tide. And advocating against the tide is a grounded theory finding. Grounded theory encourages the researcher to use terminology that helps to visualize the challenge. So advocating against the tide is me trying to say social work is in a kind of vulnerable position here, and there's a tide rushing over them. Whether that tide is the medical model, the advocacy model, the lack of education, the lack of policy procedures, they're all factors in creating the tide that the social work are advocating against. So child welfare social workers are advocates against seeking to plan safe care. My categories of my data, I have 4 conceptual categories, which was professional positioning, intellectual haze, broaching difficult conversations, and the disabling of the enabler. Again, grounded theory. These are terminologies to help you to visualize. So if I say professional positioning, I think you can kind of grasp the visual of that people are positioning themselves differently when it comes to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Kind of a common theme that came through was, this is yours, not mine, or this is mine, not yours, the opposite. So you get these kind of discourses happening on fetal alcohol when it's out in the system. Intellectual haze, I think you can gather that. I don't mind saying that when I was a social worker in the UK, it was Reader and Duncan, Beyond Blame. And I think it was Beyond Blame that talked about intellectual fog. And that's where I got my intellectual haze from. So Reader and Duncan, Beyond Blame influenced me in that context. Intellectual haze is that you can kind of see it. You know that this is there, but you can't quite see what you have to do. You can't quite see the parameters of it. So that's the intellectual haze that again comes back to the lack of education. The broaching different conversations, you can probably grasp again that for social workers to engage with a birth mom around the possibility that the child's needs and developmental and behavioral needs might be linked to fetal alcohol, that's a complex conversation to have. Again, would say that needs education. Disabling the enabler. Again, I think you can visualize what that's getting at. I guess the piece of data that I spoke there from Philippe, that was the disabling of Philippe. The medical model saying, oh, no, not go away. This is not time enough for that. So that whole disabling narrative that plays out. So professional positioning, the response to FASD in society has become one of individual ownership in contrast to best practice of collaborative working. We'll consider it again in 6 months' time. And you might have had a difficult conversation with a parent or foster parent carer about the fact that FSD is something you're concerned about. And you're going to raise it. But it damages your relationship with the carers further because the doctor says, no, too early to consider that. So again, you see the conflict here for the social worker trying to do the right thing by the caregiver or the birth mom, trying to then balance that need with the medical model just dismissing, the social worker left in a kind of difficult position. And I suppose, I know from advocacy work that I did prior with caregivers, I know that caregivers are frustrated and upset with social work. But I think this is what quite often the social work is dealing with in the process. FSDs are still suffering a class of confusion and contradictions in society to denial and intellectual haze. I think there's definitely a fear there. I mean, we're Irish. We have a huge amount of drinking, obviously, in our culture. We do not like to think of the effects of alcohol on children or that it harms children. So I think there's a protective factor there for us, as well as saying there that it's not to do with alcohol. Or sure, lots of people drink, or 1 or 2 drinks won't do any harm. So again, you can see that kind of whole intellectual haze. It's playing out in the narratives in society. Sure, 1 or 2 drinks won't do any harm. Or the fear of going there. Again, because of lack of education, not being able to perhaps move forward and have those discussions. Broaching difficult conversation. The difficulty is that when we say this generation's drinking has definitely created a cohort of people who will function suboptimally for the rest of their life or below their potential capacity as a direct cause of the drinking, that notes the blame. It's almost like we don't go there and we're unwilling to challenge it. So again, I'm very clear that my doctoral thesis, in fact, all my studies, all my research and my publications were based in Ireland. I think my doctoral study, this sort of data, I have seen and experienced this replicated. I've trained right across Europe. I trained in Poland. I trained in Spain. I've trained in Canada. I keep seeing very, very similar data come through from social workers. So this is not unique, although the study is unique to Ireland. I think it has a value to travel. Disabling the enabler. I suppose we've come down to resources and sanctioning and monies. If the medical model does not even recognize it, well, what are we at? That probably disempowers people. So we don't do the fight. The word fight came up in my data quite a lot. And that social workers talking about this concept of having to have a fight to try and plan safe care for a child with fetal alcohol. And I'm saying, that shouldn't be. If the child welfare social worker is a statutory instrument in law, they shouldn't have to fight to plan safe care for a child. They should be able to work collaboratively and multidisciplinary with the allied health colleagues, with the caregivers, in order to make the best outcome for the child. So these are real challenges and these are real problems that are in the system. And I have a strange feeling that, the more that I would go out and collect data from social workers, the more that we will hear this. And I would encourage that there needs to be, the voice of social work needs to be heard a bit more in the discourse. And so it's important that we do that. Oh, this text is small. My apologies on that. So education and training was identified needs very clearly. Policy framework is an identified need, and procedure and guidance, and the child welfare need to establish protocols, etc. Right? So what can we do? Where can we do it? So, okay, I'm worried about time, so I'm just going to, because I want to get to, okay, I'm jumping over. The findings suggest that child welfare is seeking a pathway in an education and care planning. So basically, my recommendations are around competency-based education, and what I'm going to talk to you now about a 5-step model. Competency-based. When I talked to you earlier about professional education, when I talked to you about professional education, this is what I'm talking about, and this is what I'm trained to do under the CDC. I did this program in 2011, and this is where my CPD work comes from. So your foundations, you have your alcohol use disorders, you have your alcohol screening brief interventions, your biological effects on the fetus, screening, diagnosis, assessment, treatment across the lifespan, and ethical, legal, and policy issues. So that is my certified program piece, and I kind of work out daily and trainings from that. When I do the training, I'm talking today more about my PhD. So, but I'm recommending that this should be the framework that which child welfare, schools of social work, etc., could employ with and engage with in knowledge translation. I'm talking about a pathway that social workers keep talking about, a pathway. So the pathway that I have developed as a result of the data and as a result of my work is this, what I call the 5-step model. Some of you will have heard me talk about it. You might have followed me on Twitter and you saw me reference it. So this is the 5-step model. Right. On my left, you're right, if you're looking at it, child presenting needs, and the red boxes, the children presenting to child welfare social worker from all these different catchment areas, the birth parent, the foster parent, the adoptive parent, school, maternity, social work, physician. Those are all factors of where the child may come from. The child welfare social worker in green, or the child welfare system in green. And suddenly the child welfare social worker has this case with fetal alcohol, and thinking, what do I do? Where do I go? Now, you might see that it's very fine. There's a green line going across to the big blue box on the right-hand side with an X on it, because currently what's happening is a lot of the time is that child welfare is going straight across and going for this diagnostic piece and trying to get a diagnosis, or the caregiver or indeed the social worker thinks that, oh, this is the response to fetal alcohol, I need to get a diagnosis. I'm saying no. The response to fetal alcohol is to see the child and to assess their need. And from the assessed need, you then determine what diagnosis is relevant. So you see the blue boxes going down beside the green. You have genetic screen, you have behavioral checklist, you have Vineland, you have DREF, and you have interdisciplinary care planning. Genetic screening, you are looking for one genetic panel. And so the genetic panel of intellectual disabilities, that's the panel you're looking for in a genetic screen. And again, what I'm saying to you is that the child welfare system absorbs quite a lot of children with neurodisabilities beyond just fetal alcohol. There's a number of neurodisabilities that are hidden that can look like fetal alcohol. And therefore, it's vitally important that we do genetic screens, because a lot of those neurobehavioral conditions can turn up in a genetic screen for a panel of intellectual disabilities. And again, I had a couple of months back, because I'd done this training, a social worker did because I was concerned about the profile I was seeing. And the social come back to me and said they did a genetic screen and it came back as Williams syndrome, which is, again, it's a neurodisability that's in our system. So genetic panel for intellectual disabilities. But again, child welfare needs to have some protocol here. I would be going to a private provider because the state systems are under too much pressure. Here in the US, a genetic screen is about $199, and they're $2 a penny because there's so many private providers that you can do this. But you do need protocol. You do need a consent form. Most genetic services, whether they're private or state, will have templates of genetic forms. So there shouldn't be an issue getting those templates, working them into your state system and working them into the services. But again, it comes back to this whole thing of policy, procedure, protocol, that needs to be worked out. The behavior checklist, they're about $2. I'm going to say £2, €2. Let's call it right across the board, regardless of currency conversion. You know what I mean? They're cheap. Again, child behavior checklist should be done with a social worker or foster carer. The scoring sheet for a for a behavior checklist, any professional that has a qualification of 4 years, that's the criteria for scoring a child behavior checklist. So many social workers, I have qualifications of more than 4 years. I can score it. Many social workers are out there that can score a child behavior checklist, because that is the criteria for operating and scoring the child behavior checklist. Vineland, the Vineland 3, the Vineland has been around since 1975. It's adaptive behavior, and the DREF is executive functioning. Adaptive behavior and executive functioning are the two most talked about deficits in fetal alcohol and in the FASD discourse. And it's the two most prevalent deficits that would be in the area where the child maybe has no physical features, but has the executive functioning difficulties or has adaptive behavior. So what I'm saying to you, adaptive and DREF, executive function and adaptive behavior are the two most talked about. The reason I'm putting these two tools into the model is that both of these tools have been validated. The Vineland has been around since 1974, I think. The DREF is around since 1995. But in my doctoral thesis, I have written about and shown that these tools have been validated and shown the research that validates these tools. So that's why they're there. I will say, depending on culture, that you may want to use different tools. As long as they're validated and as long as they're going to capture adaptive and executive functioning, well, that should be okay. As long as you're capturing those two areas, and as long as that the reports that are produced are in plain English that the caregiver can understand. And that's what I'd be encouraging social workers, that if you're commissioning this an adaptive or an executive function assessment, that you insist that there's a plain English version of the report, so that you can give it to the caregiver, and not just that the caregiver. Quite often, the social worker can get more value from a plain English than from something that somebody has swallowed a thesaurus and throws all this medical jargon at you. That's not what we need. These are psychosocial assessments. They need to be written in plain English. Again, I'm saying multidisciplinary care plan. I'm saying to social work that the blue line here is you as either a practitioner doing some of these pieces, or you as a case manager pulling these pieces together to create that pathway of service, of intervention. Again, we'll come back to the fact that the vast majority of children will potentially fall off the diagnostic trajectory by just getting violent and executive functioning. If they're done correctly, the potential is that that could address the need in its entirety, because the caregiver finally understands the child, etc. Okay, I'm saying on the right-hand side, then interestingly, care planning meeting can decide, are you moving forward to diagnostics? And therefore make the decision to go down to diagnostics. I'm saying that this model, it's non-labeling, and you're not medicating the child, because none of these tools in the screening response, the 5 steps, is about medication. These are very, very pragmatic, functional assessments to try and understand where the child is at. And the positivity of this model is that it works for all children. It works for all disabilities, neurodisabilities, because what you're doing is a checks and balances. You're trying to find out. And by the time you get to diagnoses, you may be not going to fetal alcohol, you may be going in a different direction, because the checks and balances, the evidence produced in the response is showing you that the child needs something different. And that's what the 5-step model is about. That's why we need to take this more slow, measured approach. And I believe this fits with what Bird and Pavlova is saying about our child welfare system needs modest modifications. That's what they said. Again, saying to you, Bird and Pavlova, long-serving experts of the fetal alcohol field, if they're saying that, we need to listen. And I'm saying, 2019, I had developed this model when I saw the Bird and Pavlova paper, but I was pleased because I think I had come to the same conclusion that certainly our child welfare population does not need the level of diagnostic mantra that we're dealing with. And certainly that children that are bouncing around the system, a diagnostics is not going to change that. It's a piece of paper. It will not change that. Working at kind of a checks and balances, working to meet the child's needs through assessment, understanding the child, understanding, is there sensory needs? What's the sensory difficulties? What's the kind of developmental piece? What's the speech language pieces? Do I need an OT to do a sensory assessment because the child is struggling in that sensory context? Yeah, all of this is going to come out in your 5-step model. And this is about seeing the child. This is about the social model of disability. This is about responding to the child's needs first. And once you've understood the need, then you may go to a diagnosis. And I joke with people saying, if I had a headache today, I don't go to a brain surgeon and have a surgery. I go through a checks and balances. I go through MRIs. I go through whatever before ever I might get, in terms of a serious condition, that I might get to a consultant for a surgeon. And I think you would accept, in any health condition, we go through checks and balances. We go to our GP. We might see the practice nurse. We might get referred to get an X-ray. We'll go back to the GP because he got the X-ray results back. He'll talk about blah, blah, blah. He might refer me to a specialist service, blah, blah. That's the standard piece that we work in health conditions. And all I'm saying is we need to work that in fetal alcohol, and we need to roll back this overly dominant diagnostic mantra. It needs to be contextualize into place. I am not against diagnosis. I'm just saying that we do checks and balances, and we try to make sure that we're not misdiagnosing children, that we are diagnosing for the right reasons, that we have a plan, that a diagnosis fits with that plan, rather than kind of, you know, time and time again, I've talked to so many carers that got a diagnosis, but had more doors closed in their face post-diagnostics by services saying, oh, that's not on our criteria. And that is obviously where, am I run out of time?
Well, we're about to run out of time, although we started late, so I'm happy to go on for a few, another 5-10 minutes. That's okay.
Okay, right. I'm not going to read this. I'm going to stay quiet for a minute, let you read it. I'm saying that this is Dr. James Fitzpatrick in Australia, again, on the back of a child death in the system. And again, he's talking very much along the lines of what I'm saying here, developmental scales, tools that we should be using in child welfare, etc. Yeah. Again, I'm talking about we need to do this kind of the shift in the narrative and trying to taper down this diagnostic thing. Barbara and Choate again noted that the FASD community is in urgent need of what social work can offer. They further suggest that policy and procedure development within child welfare service needs to engage child welfare social workers at its core. This will require a paradigm shift away from the current epidemiology, diagnostic, and behavioral containment. Dorothy Bardry and Choate are two social work profs in Canada. So they're saying very similar to what I'm saying. You know, such a paradigm shift will need to see the child with an FSD and address their presenting needs of adaptive executive sensory deficits pre-diagnostically, creating an evidence-based practice approach in the care planning process. That's kind of a kind of line for my thesis, right? Okay. Treatment approach. Let me see. Can you, again, I was going through a little bit through the kind of the process around what we can do. Again, anyone in the room that wants to talk to me, I will put up some detail at the end. If you want to develop any aspect of that, yeah. Okay, I'm just going to go there because I've not allowed any time for questioning. I've just gone on and went through which. So quick questions, quick.
Yeah, we've had a couple of requests, Liam.
Right.
Are you able to make your slides available as a PDF or something?
Yes, I'll do a PDF and send it to you. Yeah. And then potential. I will say though, please, to any person that the 5-step model needs support. I talk about it here in a slide. In my thesis, it's got, I think, 5 or 6 pages of description. For it to work in the system, it needs, you know, again, policy procedure to support it. So it's not just, you know, but I can do that. Yeah.
No, that's great. And then there's one question from Helen. Said, I'm assuming that it should say DKEF for executive functioning. Is that?
Where, on the model?
I think it's on the model. I think so.
The DREF?
Yes, I think it must be that.
So, yes, I'm sorry. The Dilius rating of executive functioning, DREF. Right. And so, again, I'm saying it's a very, it's been road tested. It's a very good tool. And I do recommend it quite highly. Pearson UK, you can get those tools from Pearson UK, no problem. I would encourage people like Susan, university educators, maybe Pearson UK could come in and give a talk about developmental screening because they want to sell their tools. So they would probably come in and do that talk as well in education.
I'll have a look at that. Thank you. I don't know, has anyone got any? Oh, there is some questions. Sorry, they've appeared. So it's so Helen was saying, yes, there are other tools such as the brief. So it sounds like Helen has some experience of more experience than me of these tools. And Indarajit says, thank you, really appreciate it. So I think that's been really informative, Liam. I think that's been really helpful.
I say, Susan, I do find it difficult, having done full days of, I know that this is a massively complex topic. There's a lot of competing demands within that topic. You know, I didn't talk so much about prevention. I didn't talk so much about birth moms. I didn't talk, you know, there's so many areas you can go. So I think it's difficult to do that. So anyway, I'll be quiet.
No, that's fine. Has anyone got any final pressing questions that they want to ask? I mean, perhaps we could have a conversation about, because I think it has been really helpful to come back and look at some of those other things perhaps next yearly, and we can have another conversation and see if that we can look at some of these, do you know what I mean, develop some of these things, because I think there's been lots in there which has been really helpful. I've had lots of thoughts about, probably we are encountering lots more of this sort of these difficulties than we probably are aware of, but also that actually that there are solutions beyond going for medical diagnoses, which I think we do on a lot of levels. It's not just for this. I think that's often a go-to answer, is to try and get a medical diagnosis. And I think you're right that often that doesn't really take us forward anywhere in terms of what we're going to do, other than medicating children.
Yeah. And certainly the young man that I did a consult yesterday, I mean, the level of medication that young man is on, and yet the social workers are struggling because nothing really has changed, you know. And I used to work in secure accommodation, and the kids were all popping Ritalin, and I used to think at the time, the Ritalin is not making any difference. So I think if you're a social worker with a kid with these and taking these medications and you're not seeing a change, well, that kind of is telling you that maybe the diagnosis is wrong because the medication is wrong if it's not working. Yeah, and that's something we need to think about.
No, that's
okay.
That's great. Thank you, Liam. So thank you everyone for coming. I will end the webinar. The webinar will be available on the Wolverhampton Social Work YouTube channel. It'll probably take me about a week to get it on. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Liam. That was really, really helpful. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Susan, for reaching out, you know, as well, because I say, I know it's a difficult one for social work academics, maybe to want to open this kind of worms, but I'm so grateful. I did education at McGill University, Concordia University, you know, so it's necessary to come into social work education. So I'm really grateful.
No problem. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.